Hi, this is Bill, and this is Propaganda. When I started this YouTube channel a few months ago, I focused 2 episodes on the English prog rock band Emerson, Lake and Palmer, with the first of the 2 episodes focused on the factors leading to the formation of the band, and the second focused on the making of the band's debut album in the summer of 1970. Those 2 episodes have been among the most popular on the channel. For those of you who have taken the time to watch the 2 episodes, I thank you tremendously. For those of you who haven't seen those episodes, they are still posted here on Propaganda at this location. Feel free to check those out. They're a little on the long side. The 2 episodes taken together run about 90 minutes, but there's a lot of detail there, and I hope you find them informative. I hinted at the end of the second of the 2 episodes that I might continue the story of Emerson, Lake and Palmer with discussion of their second and third albums, both made in 1971. Their second studio album, TARKUS, and their third album, first live album, Pictures at an Exhibition. Several of you have reached out and said you would like to see those episodes completed and posted. And now that I've had a few months to follow other directions on the channel, I've decided to go back and follow up on that promise that I hinted at. This episode will focus on the making of TARKUS, and we'll follow it up with a subsequent episode on the making of Pictures in an Exhibition. So, with that introduction, here is the story of TARKUS. As I pointed out in our previous episode on ELP, the band did a fair amount of touring in the latter part of 1970 following their completion of recording of their debut album. Keith Emerson and Carl Palmer became fairly close during this period, and it was not uncommon for the 2 of them to hang out in their dressing rooms prior to or after a show and try out new musical ideas on each other. One idea that Carl Palmer brought to Keith Emerson was a rhythm pattern that would form the beginning of what would become the TARKUS suite, the first section of the suite called Eruption. Carl played for Keith the rhythm in 5/4 time that would form the basis of Eruption, and it stuck in Keith Emerson's head. Upon completion of their late 1970 tour, Keith began doing some work to try and bring this rhythm to life, and pretty much completed all of what would become the Eruption section of TARKUS. He may have done work on other sections of the suite also. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But Keith was very excited about the prospect of moving forward with an extended suite of original music, and reached out to Greg Lake to share that thought with him and to play him a little bit of Eruption, which he did in early January of 1971. Greg Lake was less than impressed, apparently. Greg was always the member of the band to consider the commercial aspects of what the band were doing, and his reaction to what Keith Emerson played for him was, and this is a direct quote from Keith Emerson from his 2004 autobiography, Pictures of an Exhibitionist. Upon hearing Eruption, Greg's response apparently was, "If you want to play that kind of music, I suggest you do it on your solo album." By early 1971, with the success of the first album in the UK, Greg Lake had already begun thinking about the prospect of doing a solo album either including Emerson and Palmer or possibly outside musicians. So the concept of a solo album wasn't something that was news to Keith Emerson. However, Emerson saw this piece of music as one that would be a watershed for Emerson, Lake and Palmer, that would set them apart from other bands that were beginning to mine the progressive rock space. He thought that would make the band truly unique. In fact, he was quoted as saying, "We'll blow every other band off of the stand if we play this." Lake did not agree and apparently walked out of the meeting. In Greg Lake's autobiography, Lucky Man, completed shortly before his death, Lake recounts part of the story and does not dispute it. But he does claim that this was strictly based on commercial considerations, that he didn't feel that what Emerson was playing in Eruption had any commercial viability to it, that it wouldn't find its way to radio airplay, and he couldn't see in his mind how it would link up into the rest of a song or a suite. And as I said, Greg certainly was, of the three members of ELP, the one who was mostly focused on commercial matters. But that being said, I suspect there were likely other matters going through Greg Lake's mind upon hearing Emerson's work. One was that it was a piece of music that Emerson was pursuing on his own without Lake's input. In a new band, it is generally the case, at least at the start, that the members of a band work together on material. ELP, to a certain degree on their first album, had already violated that, with Emerson writing most of the music for the album. Lake had left King Crimson a year prior to these discussions, in part because he felt his input as a musician wasn't being listened to by Robert Fripp and by Ian MacDonald. And given that, he probably was a bit sensitive about Emerson going off in a direction that he hadn't had any input to and wasn't particularly well in agreement with. Another concern of Lake's, I suspect, might have been how he perceived the public would consume a piece of this nature. Emerson, of course, had been an instrumental star prior to Emerson, Lake and Palmer with his prior group, The Nice, who dabbled in long keyboard-driven compositions as well as classical compositions. Lake had, I'm sure in his mind, already made a serious compromise with Emerson in allowing the classical piece Pictures of an Exhibition to be performed regularly by ELP. In Lake's mind, I'm sure, and Emerson has commented on this over the years as well, Lake probably felt that listening audiences would hear Pictures of an Exhibition and relate it back more to the work of The Nice than to ELP as a whole, and view that this was Keith Emerson's band more so than anyone else's. Finally, there's the matter of songwriting royalties. Emerson had pursued evidently a fair amount of work to write the opening pieces of what would become the TARKUS suite on his own, and Lake likely was a bit concerned, again given his commercial bent, that there might not be very much opportunity for him to contribute either music or lyrics to the overall composition. So, granted, some of this is speculation, but I'm sure that some or all of these thoughts were going through Greg Lake's head, given the history of this band. Ultimately, the decision was made to have a band meeting to discuss the situation. Emerson was very much taken aback by his view that Lake was just dismissing his work, and at one point threatened that the band should just split up right here. The band's managers, John Gayden and David Enthoven at EG Records, obviously didn't want to see that happen, with the band's first album having been a major success in the UK and also hitting the charts in a big way in the United States by this point. In reviewing the matter, Greg Lake stated to Enthoven and Gayden his concerns about the lack of commercial potential for the piece, and was asked by Enthoven and Gaydon what he thought the direction for the band should be instead. What had he written to go forward? And at least at this point, Lake had nothing to offer. He had assumed, apparently, that work would be done in the studio to conceive ELP's second album. Given that, Enthoven and Gaydon suggested to go into the studio and see what they could do with Emerson's work. They had already booked at Vision Studios with the engineer Eddie Offord to do some work in the month of January 1971, and the thinking was, with nothing else to develop, that maybe something could be done to develop Eruption and the other pieces of the suite into a full-fledged whole. And that is what was done. The following day, Emerson, Lake and Palmer entered at Vision Studios with Offord and began working through the structure of the piece. For the first day, maybe two, Lake apparently was still unimpressed, but the more he heard, the more he was able to get his arms around the work that Emerson had done, and began contributing ideas at that point for the overall arrangement of the piece, as well as ideas for lyrics in the various sections where Emerson had conceived of them. It's been written in some accounts of this story that Emerson had come to Advision with the music for the TARKUS suite fully formed. I personally doubt that that's true for a couple of reasons. In the first place is the matter of how the writing is credited on the album itself. Very notably, Greg Lake is credited as not only the lyricist, but the writer of the music of the Battlefield section of TARKUS. Given that Emerson was adamant about recording the TARKUS suite, if Emerson had written the Battlefield section, I'm sure he would have fought like hell to get credit for it. The other thing about Battlefield is that it is very reminiscent of Greg Lake's style and earlier work. It's a relatively simple piece, whereas much of the TARKUS suite is fairly complex, both in terms of meter and in terms of the keys in which the music is played. Battlefield is effectively a blues in the key of E minor. It's a relatively simple piece from a musical perspective. And it's one also that is relatively similar to the song Epitaph, which Greg Lake participated in writing with King Crimson a year or so before. Epitaph, of course, was often quoted in performances of the Battlefield section by Emerson, Lake and Palmer in live performance going forward. So that being said, I'm quite certain that Greg Lake is the author there. For other sections of the suite, I'm sure it was Emerson at the helm. But even there, Greg Lake makes some notable contributions. Lake had contributed a minimum of electric guitar to the debut album. His electric guitar work on the debut is limited to the song Lucky Man and really only to one instrumental verse of the song. In the TARKUS suite, electric guitar appears both as a rhythm instrument during the mass section of the suite and famously in Battlefield, with Lake taking a full-fledged guitar solo with multiple overdubs. So by the time the TARKUS suite was complete, it was a group composition with significant work done by the three members of the band and by Eddie Offord. And it is, to my ears, one of the most compelling pieces of music that Emerson, Lake and Palmer ever produced. Really, the only fault that I can find with it is that it was probably recorded too quickly. The writing and recording of the song, according to Emerson, were done in the space of a week. And there are some sections of it where that shows. The edits between the group sections and the organ solo sections, for example, in the Manticore section of TARKUS, are very audible, very choppy. Eddie Offord very likely just did these cuts with a razor blade and left it as it was in order to put together the finished product. On the final solo section of the piece, TARKUS, there is one very audible wrong note played by Emerson as the Moog solo section of the song fades out. Why that wasn't faded out earlier, or why something else wasn't done to mask it, I can only guess. However, 50-odd years later, that is still with us. In any event, TARKUS is a masterful piece. Emerson's instincts as far as its ability to blow other bands off the stage were right on the money. This was a track that would be a staple of Emerson, Lake and Palmer's live shows going forward from the release of the album until their 1977 tour with the orchestra to support their Works Volume 1 album, and ultimately would return even after that tour, although in an abbreviated form. It's one of the songs that defines the band, to be sure. It took about 2 weeks of time for the band to record the TARKUS album in full. The first week of recording was spent on the TARKUS suite itself. And at that point, there was nothing else ready for the band to record. So they took a little bit of time away from the studio to get some thoughts down on paper, and then upon returning to the studio in February of 1971, began working on the songs that would comprise side 2 of the album in its vinyl format. Several songs were key songs for side 2 from the beginning. Bitch's Crystal, Keith Emerson's semi-tribute to Dave Brubeck, is among those. It's a wonderfully played piece of boogie-woogie piano with Carl Palmer supporting him in the style of Dave Brubeck's drummer Joe Morello. The mini suite of The Only Way and Infinite Space is also a key track. 7 minutes worth of wonderful organ music from Emerson, some very heavy lyrical content from Greg Lake, and a great piano section to complete the song with Emerson and Palmer taking center stage on that. A Time and a Place, the heavy rocker that follows the mini suite, is one that probably should have been the single from the album. A Time and a Place is a very tightly constructed piece of music with Emerson's organ and Moog synthesizer leads really blowing the doors off. This would have been a wonderful final track to the album, in my opinion. There were 3 other songs that were recorded for side 2, 2 of which were used, 1 was not. And in some regards, I think some unfortunate decisions were made here. The 2 songs that were used were the music hall number by Keith Emerson based on Stephen Foster's old folk song from the 19th century, O Susanna, which became Jeremy Bender. And the band's takeoff with new lyrics that praise the work of Eddie Offord in the studio, Are You Ready, Eddie? Which is very obviously based on the song that Bobby Troup wrote for Little Richard in 1956, The Girl Can't Help It. The song that probably should have been used here was ultimately left as an outtake, that song being Greg Lake's Oh My Father. Lake wrote Oh My Father as a tribute to his own father who had recently died. And it's a beautiful piece of music that probably was left off the album for a number of reasons. The first reason, probably the most important of them all, is that the song is constructed very much in the way that Lucky Man was. It's relatively simple in its composition, but also is a very layered song with multiple overdubs of harmony vocals, overdubbed acoustic and lead guitars, and not a whole lot of room for keyboard. I suspect that the song would have been a logical choice to use as a single in some ways because of its similarities to Lucky Man. But I also can't see, given those similarities, that Keith Emerson would have approved of its use as a single, since he wasn't very pleased about Lucky Man being the single from the first album. But that being said, Oh My Father is a very strong track, much stronger than either Jeremy Bender or Are You Ready, Eddie? I've always thought that the right way to have constructed side 2 of TARKUS would have been with Bitch's Crystal first, followed by Oh My Father, and then picking up with the mini suite and with A Time and a Place, with A Time and a Place closing the album. Constructing side 2 in that way would have actually made side 2 a little bit longer than what was ultimately constructed for release, and I think the music would have worn much better. You know, reviews of TARKUS today almost unfailingly call out Jeremy Bender and Are You Ready, Eddie as songs that haven't aged well and that probably would have been best left on the cutting room floor. TARKUS ended up being a huge success, despite the reservations that Greg Lake had had about its commercial potential. The album was released in Europe in June of 1971. It reached #1 on the English charts very soon after its release. In the United States, given that ELP's debut album had been released a couple of months later than it had been in Europe, the decision was made to delay its release in the US and in Canada as well. TARKUS would be released in North America in August of 1971 and would reach #9 on the Billboard charts, one of their strongest showings. It's not a perfect album, but TARKUS was definitely a strong follow-up to the debut and is one that I constantly go back to. In my mind, the TARKUS suite is one of the strongest things Emerson, Lake and Palmer ever did. I personally think the only other piece of music that rivals TARKUS for its complexity and for being just a compelling piece of music that draws the listener in would be the Carnival 9 suite that ELP would write for the Brain Salad Surgery album a few years later in 1973. Interestingly, while all this was going on, ELP was also contemplating Pictures in an Exhibition, ultimately recording that suite live at Newcastle in mid-March of 1971, before TARKUS was released. We'll talk about that experience and what happened with that album in our next episode. As always, please click on like and hit subscribe if you haven't already done so. You take good care, and we will be back soon. Bye-bye.